was born in the West End. I lived at 32 Poplar Street, which was six sunny rooms. And it was a nice apartment. I hated to leave it. In like 3 months, they evacuated the whole area and went about demolishing it. The excuse was they were doing it for these people to have them a better life. And none of that ever became the truth. The truck came and they gave you $100 for moving expenses and get out. That was it. They can't do that. That's crazy. This is America.
By the 1950s, many U.S. cities were in decline. Boston was no exception. The city was almost bankrupt, and its bond rating was near junk level. The Great Depression had taken its toll, and decades of rule under Mayor James Curley had left the city with ethnic and class rivalries, an alienated business community, and the highest tax rate of any major American city. Boston's manufacturing base had collapsed, and new industries, along with middle-class residents, left for the suburbs in droves. Boston's population loss was one of the most significant of any American metropolis. The Boston Globe called it a hopeless backwater and a tumbled-down has-been of a city.
Ancient, crumbling, this happens to be Boston, 1960, but it could be New York, London, or San Francisco. Nearly every city and town has its blight area.
Boston faced a serious housing shortage, a problem made worse as large numbers of veterans returned from the war, looking to settle down and raise families.
Nothing was being built during the Second World War, and then you had the necessity to house not only veterans who were returning, but an increase in population and the prosperity that followed World War II.
In 1949, the election of John Hines unseated the controversial four-term mayor James Michael Curley, who had recently served time in federal prison for mail fraud. The former mayor was beloved by his working-class constituents, but hated by the city's business community and Brahmin elites, whom he continuously alienated. These rifts were detrimental to Boston's economic state, as businesses and well-off residents increasingly vacated the city.
In 1949, there was a movement to create a new Boston. And the new Boston was to get rid of that kind of graft and, in a way, replace it with another type of patronage.
The World War II generation had witnessed astonishing technological leaps, and it was felt by many that such advances, coupled with government power, could alleviate the ills of society. There was an activist mentality among many young professionals, a desire to create positive changes in their downtrodden city. Prominent among these young reformers was an ambitious graduate of Harvard Law School, Jerome Rappaport. Having supported Hines' campaign, he now became the mayor's assistant secretary. In 1950, he founded the New Boston Committee, or NBC, a civic group determined to reverse the policies of James Curley.
The group that replaced the ward boss kind of politics was rooted in the businesses downtown, because they were losing the population to the suburbs, they were losing the manufacturing to the suburbs, and consequently they wanted to put a stop to that by creating this vision that, Boston was changing.
Hines' election coincided with President Truman's Housing Act of 1949. The act was intended to revitalize urban economies, resolve the housing shortage, and improve the conditions of low-income neighborhoods. Funds were to be offered for slum clearance, the demolition and rebuilding of blighted neighborhoods to entice middle and upper-class residents back to the city, along with increased tax revenue and economic growth, a process termed urban renewal.
Finally, the nation is arising to rescue its unhappy main streets More and more rapidly, every city is moving against the tide of decay. Aging but sound buildings are being renewed. These in a poorer condition are being raised and replaced by new and exciting developments.
A mass slum clearance couldn't have happened without the federal government's intervention, and that came about as a result of the Housing Act of 1949, where Title I allowed for cities to get 2/3 the amount of money that it would take to clear an entire neighborhood once it was qualified as a slum, and then the city would only have to put in 1/3 of the money.
City leaders saw these federal funds as the solution to the city's economic distress. Under Hines, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, or BRA, undertook the city's first renewal project, the New York streets. Part of Boston's South End, the neighborhood was a small, multi-ethnic, and working-class tenement community. It would soon be razed to the ground. The project did little to resolve the housing shortage and resulted in hundreds of families in need of homes.
In the case of the New York streets, they replaced residential housing with light manufacturing.
When they did the New York streets, nobody wanted to move there, so it became an industrial block rather than. So they went looking for a place in a good location where people would want to go, right on the Charles.
Boston's West End was an ethnically diverse community with a rich history dating back to the earliest days of the city. Initially used for industry, the area became a wealthy residential neighborhood in the 18th century and a prominent African American community with strong abolitionist activity in the early 19th century.
The black neighborhood on Beacon Hill was really what made the West End a neighborhood. And then the Irish came in the 1850s, and it became more of a white neighborhood. And then you had the Eastern Europeans that came in 1880, and then you had the Italians that came in 1900, and it became the West End, so to speak.
English, Italian, Russian, Canadian, Polish, Irish, Austrian, and a dozen other nationalities. The West End was Boston's melting pot and could teach a lesson about tolerance to many so-called better communities.
The neighborhood displayed a remarkable degree of tolerance and friendliness within its dense and diverse community. By 1900, the West End was home to more foreign-born residents than anywhere else in the city.
Like I said, we had everything here. Irish, Jewish, Russian, German, we all got along beautifully. The children included, which is a very rare thing.
But city officials viewed the West End as a prime candidate for renewal. Studies were conducted which presented the neighborhood in a grim light.
Streets, narrow and ragged, strewn with filth. Ideal, perhaps, for the horse and wagon, but completely inadequate for today's demands.
Inspectors reported that 80% of structures were substandard or marginal, and rates of crime and disease were seen as disproportional to most other urban communities. Dirty, dangerous, and overcrowded conditions were cited as evidence of urban decay.
Buildings beyond the age of usefulness and beyond repair. Crowded together, denying sunlight and fresh air. Strangling life.
But these studies often drew on prejudice and propaganda, ignoring the strong social fabric of the neighborhood.
You really had a strong identity. We really did.
You can't measure a feeling by the age of the buildings. It's the relationships between neighbors and the makeup of the whole area that means so much.
One of the people who came to study the social dynamics of the neighborhood was a man by the name of Herb Gans. And the idea was to study the effects of urban renewal and find out what the attitude of the people who lived here was about their neighborhood. And they didn't see it as a slum. They saw it as a poor working class neighborhood where people were actually happy. And Herb Gans turned around and gave it the name Urban Village.
If you came from the West End, whether you owned property or didn't own property, you believed the West End belonged to you.
One of the strongest defenders of the West End was Joseph Lee Jr. Born into a wealthy family of Beacon Hill Brahmins, Lee was a staunch advocate for community improvement who worked to create recreational opportunities for neighborhood youth. Lee was horrified by the decision to raise the West End, and his own research called the government's findings into question.
The big question that's always asked is, was the West End a slum? In order to qualify for federal money, it had to be qualified or quantified as a slum. So there was a set of criteria that was implemented, and some of those criteria were fulfilled, some of them were manufactured.
Lee noted contradictory statements by the Housing Authority, who at one point condemned the thinning out of the neighborhood's population, while simultaneously using its high population density as a reason for its slum designation. He countered the city's allegation that apartments lacked sunlight by pointing out a comparable lack of light in the proposed development. Though the city cited the lack of elevators in residential buildings as evidence of slum conditions, Lee pointed out the lack of elevators in wealthier neighborhoods, such as nearby Beacon Hill. He noted that the supposedly excessive tuberculosis rates were wrongly ascribed to the project area, using Boston Health Department statistics to disprove the Housing Authority's claims. He also noted that the alleged abundance of juvenile delinquency in the West End was false. Lee's findings were compiled into numerous impassioned letters, including one sent to Mayor Hines in July of 1957. But the evidence he compiled failed to convince city leaders. Ironically, by officially announcing the project and by labeling the neighborhood a slum, city officials may have exacerbated the very conditions that were used to justify the West End's demise.
They said, don't fix up your house because if you do, you won't get paid for it. Street cleaning became spasmodic, okay? And you come out in this dirt in the streets and everything, nobody's cleaning the streets. And the other part is garbage pickup instead of like twice a week, right? It's going like once every other week, right? Things are overflowing. I mean, it started looking like a slum.
They told people not to fix up their homes, so it made the neighborhood look even more depressed.
If they're going to take it and say it's a slum, they have to make it look like a slum. That's what I think.
Numerous hearings were conducted to discuss the city's plan. The results were often contentious. During a hearing on May 28, 1957, the Central Labor Union, the General Director of Mass General Hospital, the League of Women Voters, and others all offered their adamant support of the project. Though each offered compelling reasons for their support, often quoting from the Housing Authority's study on slum conditions, they were challenged by several city councilors who called the basis behind their support into question.
If I was living in a rat hole, like you say, it'd be different. Say, well, geez, she should get out, for her own sake. But if the house is nice, why should you leave? And if the rent is reasonable, we never had rats, we never had no kind of bugs or nothing.
Another controversy was the initial promise of housing for displaced residents. Such promises were made at earlier stages of the project, but such reassurances decreased with each passing year, and by the time of eviction, they had ceased entirely.
And I got 3 children, and I'm on aid. I can't afford just to go in a place and pay high rent.
With regard to relocation, I don't think that there was a clear relocation plan at all. I think relocation was an afterthought to the displacement of the people.
But as I understand, they're only making it for the richer people, and they're making it for their benefit. Why don't they make it for our benefit?
In 1958, residents of the West End found their doors plastered with eviction notices.
3,000 families compelled to make room for new high-rent apartment buildings. Here, the fruit of progress is anger, fear, and confusion. Midwinter 1959, all but the most reluctant have gone. Hundreds of buildings remain, standing cold and empty, looking down on a stillness, a silence, new and unfamiliar.
They came in down around Brighton Street, over where the expressway is, and they started taking down buildings.
I even cried. I could see my daughter's bedroom from the house. I could see. And I had the children look up. It was really a shame. I mean, and those three children really took it in their hearts and everything that they said, Ma, look at the house that we loved coming down.
It's just like their attitude was, they don't count anyway. We felt that who the hell were they to come in and take our neighborhood? You know, we fought back. When they brought the crane in, right, we hacksawed everything. And another night hit it with a Molotov cocktail. And we had to show them that we counted.
At this point, neighborhood resistance was too little, too late. By 1960, the neighborhood was nearly gone.
While there was some pushback, it wasn't the type of pushback you would have gotten today.
Once demolished, the former West End was turned into a massive parking lot and remained so for years. Aside from a few historic structures, nearly every building in the project area was destroyed. Rappaport's connections to Mayor Hines now proved beneficial. He and his partners, Sean Bonin and Theodore Schulman, were now given the bid to redevelop the West End site. The development would be called Charles River Park, and the decision would create lasting controversy. Under his leadership, the original plan of affordable units for former West Enders was scrapped. The units would instead be luxury apartments. There were accusations of favoritism stemming from his connection to Hines, and allegations of greed and financial impropriety. Joseph Lee Jr. was a particularly vocal critic of Rappaport's involvement. In a letter to the Finance Commission in July 1957, Lee called the deal a violation of state law and asked for an investigation. Once again, Lee's warnings failed to alter the course of events, and Rappaport's plans for Charles River Park moved forward.
He said the city was going down into a morass and it would never come out of it, but he built Charles River Park, right? And that changed the whole direction of the city. Around his buildings, I mean, yes, there probably was an economic benefit, right? But once you got out farther, he didn't turn the city around. In no way he turned the city around. He was a very brilliant guy, but he probably should have spent some time hanging on corners. He probably would have had a different perspective.
Once the dust had settled from Boston's urban renewal projects of the 1950s and early 1960s, it was clear that the city's landscape had been dramatically affected. Along with the New York streets and West End projects, Boston's historic Scollay Square, a red light district once famous for its nightlife and lavish theaters, was razed to make way for the concrete expanse of Government Center and its brutalist City Hall.
It's a hard, tough place, like the city itself.
I wonder in my own mind where Boston would be without the sometimes crude, rude redevelopment process. And I suspect that Boston would be in pretty sorry shape.
Post-demolition surveys concluded that although some residents had relocated to better housing, many ended up worse off than before and were scattered around the city, unable to recreate the strong sense of community they once enjoyed. Many were traumatized by the experience.
A lot of these older people that were 60, 70, that lived there all their life, when they moved, they died.
Why, I think it was worse than lost, or what they did to these poor people. They just dribbed them out of their home.
I mean, you're in a place that you want to be, and somebody else comes in and says, "Get the hell out." You know? And you say, "Who the hell are you?"
The severe destruction and dislocation created by the West End project generated increasing criticism. A New York Times article from April 1964 called the West End demolition a definitive demonstration of how to destroy a community with a bulldozer. Yet others felt the new community was an improvement, and many residents made comfortable homes in the new development.
Whenever you touch where a man lives and where he makes his living, you touch a very tender point. And yet the problems in American cities are not capable of being solved by easy solutions, and renewal is not easy.
In 1959, Mayor John Collins was elected. In partnership with his new BRA leader, Ed Logue, ongoing renewal projects were informed by lessons from the West End. Though demolition continued, it was often balanced with preservation and rehabilitation, along with increased community involvement. But renewal projects continued to generate controversy, garnering both praise and condemnation.
Let me give you my reaction to this beautiful plaza. Someone, I think it was Goethe, who said that architecture is frozen music. And if that be true, then the architects here waved their magic wands, the bricklayers rubbed their Aladdin lamp, and they created this thing of beauty.
And look at that. And Philip really should be ashamed of himself, Philip Johnson. Those Palladian windows, 40 stories, 50 stories high, what could have gotten into him anyhow? What drives me crazy here, this is the most wonderful people place in the whole city. Then you get this monster here. It bothers me more than any building in Boston. Here's this wonderful old customs house, which used to have this skyline all to itself. And then that glass wall, I mean, how could they do that? It ought to have the same texture as what's below, as North Market, as Quincy Market, and as the customs house does. We should have established a firm and unbreakable policy that there could be nothing but masonry walled buildings in downtown Boston, and this would be a better city for it. That wouldn't have happened, that wouldn't have happened.
Changes in renewal tactics during the 1960s were further influenced by a change in public opinion. Faith in government, prevalent in the 1950s, was replaced with cynicism and mistrust during the Vietnam era. People increasingly stood up against what they felt was injustice.
As Americans, we wanted at that point to comply, but post-1960s, I don't think the West End would have been torn down.
If they had taken it after 1965, the anti-war movements and everything were in, it would have never happened. They were supposed to take the South End. The South End was supposed to be demolished. It was supposed to go. They didn't do it because of the anti-war movement and people ready to get up there and get in their faces, you know. So it would have all changed. It would have probably still been a West End, and I probably would have still been hanging on a corner.
Were Boston's early attempts at urban renewal a success? From a purely economic standpoint, the city substantially improved from the 1940s through the present, but these improvements took decades. For example, Boston's bond rating went from near junk level in 1949 to a perfect AAA rating by 2014.
Boston gambled, and they won.
The failure of urban renewal was not to focus on the original goal, which was to replenish housing.
The city's population ultimately rebounded, but declines continued until the 1980s. Blighted areas were replaced with updated construction, and many notable improvements were made. Yet the potential for rehabilitation and restoration in many areas was lost. Ultimately, renewal projects have the potential to effectively blend old and new if skillfully and sensitively executed.
I think it's been quite sensitive to what was here before. The new stuff fits in with the old. This is an old timer. This is a real old timer, and so's that. And they were pretty dowdy looking things, I can tell you. This is new. But people walking along here 10 years from now won't realize quickly that it's any younger than that stuff there.
And I was surprised to find myself walking down a narrow street. The buildings were freshly painted, looked like they're in good condition, looked like a very nice place to live. And I had to inquire to find out that I was in a renewal project. That's the future of renewal, I think, in the United States.
The South End, buildings were collapsing. In the early 50s, buildings were just falling down, right there. There was 2 or 3 that was in the paper. The buildings down there were terrible. Now they're $3 million tenements. I mean, you know, it's in the eye of the beholder.
It appears that lessons have been learned, but could the West End have been handled differently and still accomplish the project goals?
Back then, if they did any rehab at all, it would not have been qualified as urban renewal, and they would not have qualified for federal funding.
They probably could have done it in a much better way, okay? On one of the things that the Rappaport was saying, the reason he took the whole neighborhood down at once was he didn't want any slums next to his buildings when he put them up.
And so the West End ended up being the sacrificial lamb of, you know, Boston's bond rating.
Today, the neighborhood is largely a mix of residential high-rises and commercial development, mostly dating from the 1960s onward. The area is home to various Boston institutions, including TD Garden, Massachusetts General Hospital, and North Station, each possessing a rich history of their own. By 2010, the West End's population was just over 4,000, nearly a 50% decrease from the final years of the old neighborhood. In sharp contrast to the dense urban environment which once existed, today's residential areas offer gardens and substantial open space, but feelings about the new neighborhood are mixed.
So you end up with the West End at one time put more kids in Boston Latin School. It became a luxury neighborhood that all of a sudden didn't even have a public school. It didn't even have a community center anymore. It went from having some voice or a weak voice as an immigrant neighborhood to very little voice because it doesn't have politicians, it doesn't have a newspaper, it doesn't have a strong vision as a neighborhood.
There's no schools down there. They wiped out the schools. They wiped out, I mean, it's really not what you would call a whole neighborhood. Okay, it's just not.
It is often said that time heals all wounds, but even with the passing of decades, emotional scars remain for many former residents. But nearly 30 years after the demolition of the West End, new opportunities for remembering and healing began to appear. Created by former resident Jim Campano, the West Ender newsletter began in 1985, offering residents a platform to share memories and reconnect with their long-lost community. A video version of the newsletter was eventually created. In 1991, the founding of the West End Museum offered a new and important means of preserving the neighborhood's past through its collection of surviving materials and through exhibits, tours, and presentations.
This museum wouldn't exist without Jim Campano. You know, he's the person that started the West Ender newsletter. He's the person that kept the memory of the West End alive. I mean, the fact that it's even called the West End today can be directly drawn back to him. There's nobody else that has contributed to the memory of what went on here than Jim.
I'm almost 81. I've done whatever I'm going to do. I've kept the culture, at least, you know, the written culture of the West End together. So I feel I've done enough to justify whatever my existence is, you know.
In 2021, 3 of the remaining buildings were slated for demolition. The former West End House, built in 1903, the Winchell School, built in 1885, and a former tenement house built in the 1890s. Today, all 3 structures are owned by Mass General Hospital. Though preservationists worked with the hospital to accommodate the proposed expansion without demolishing the structures, no acceptable alternative was found.
You know, we're going to lose the last 3 buildings in the West End because of institutional expansion. Is it worth it? Well, I think what Mass General is going to contribute back to the community is a step in the right direction. Even though we're going to lose a physical building from that era, we're going to gain something for the community that's potentially community building.
I would like them to stay, but I know sooner or later they're going to go.
Change and progress are necessary and important. Yet progress must be balanced with an appreciation of the past. Our individual and collective experiences as human beings deserve to be remembered and respected, and the balance between progress and preservation is a tenuous one, with competing objectives, viewpoints, and priorities.
What you have just seen is taking place today in most major American cities. Many families, individuals, and small businessmen are being displaced by urban renewal programs which are needed to revitalize our urban centers. Some people will be assisted by urban renewal. Others will be hurt. It is inevitable. Much has been done to minimize the impact of displacement. More must be done.
As cities continue their process of inevitable change, the demolition of the West End offers important lessons on how urban neighborhoods can be more respectfully and effectively improved.
I think it's really about controlling the narrative within your neighborhood. Remember, the BRA represents money, the money interest, and the developers have a plan. The institutions have a plan. It's called a business plan. They're going to impose that plan on a group of people who don't have a plan. And they're probably going to be successful at it. And the BRA is going to partner with them in the execution of their plan because there is no counter plan. And I think that that's probably the #1 lesson to be learned from urban renewal.
Memories of the Old West End retain a nostalgic and affectionate quality, enhanced by the neighborhood's disappearance. 42 Lomasney Way, once an anonymous tenement in a row of identical structures, offers a mysterious snapshot of days gone by, perhaps more striking and notable than if it were surrounded by its original row of buildings. Ironically, for many, the neighborhood retains more importance and richness precisely because it no longer exists. And with the continued loss of former residents and remaining structures, the neighborhood will likely exist one day only in memories. were spared the sight, I hope, of actually seeing your home destroyed. You're actually where you grew up.
Yeah. Yeah. It's strange. Every once in a while, I dream about it. I mean, nothing really like. Just I don't even know why just I'm in there, right? But that's about it.